The metal corridors of Kepler Station hummed with their usual mechanical rhythm as Jake made his rounds. He was a Valerian Guardian, though after 300 cycles of service, the weight of that title had started to feel like a burden rather than an honor. His crystalline body caught the fluorescent lights as he walked, casting strange shadows on the walls. Most humans found him unsettling to look at. Jake had stopped caring what they thought long ago. The supply sector was supposed to be empty at this hour. Nobody ever came here, just endless rows of containers holding freeze-dried food, spare parts, and equipment that nobody really needed anymore. Jake's sensors picked up an anomaly on the thermal scan. Something warm. Something breathing. His instinct told him to investigate. When he pushed open the door to storage room 7, he found her. The woman was lying on the floor, curled up on a thin emergency blanket like it was the most comfortable bed in the world. Her name tag said Riley, and her uniform was patched in about 5 different places. She was a maid, one of the low-level maintenance workers that the colony barely acknowledged. Her dark hair was matted with sweat, and her face was peaceful in sleep, like she didn't have a care in the world. But it was what she was holding that made Jake's entire system freeze. Nestled against her chest was a baby drakeling. Jake's processors raced through the implications. Drakelings were supposed to be extinct. They'd been hunted to extinction during the Cataclysm Wars, or so the official records claimed. They were classified as prohibited fauna, dangerous anomalies, creatures that didn't fit into the ordered structure of the colony. Finding one meant immediate confiscation and termination. Finding one in the arms of a human maid meant a security breach, a protocol violation, and about 50 different forms to fill out. Jake should have called it in immediately. Instead, he just stood there watching. The baby dragon was no bigger than Riley's hand. Its scales were the color of deep violet twilight, with flecks of silver that seemed to catch the light from nowhere. Its breathing was shallow and rapid, matching Riley's own steady inhales and exhales like they were connected somehow. The creature's tiny claws rested gently on the fabric of Riley's uniform, not threatening, not aggressive, just holding on. And Riley, even in sleep, had her arms curved protectively around it like she would shield it from the entire universe if she had to. Jake had been trained his entire life to see things in terms of rules and systems. Order and chaos. Allowed and forbidden. But something about this scene didn't fit into any of those categories. The way Riley held that dragon wasn't the way someone holds contraband. It wasn't the way someone holds a mistake or a problem. It was the way someone holds something they love. He accessed the security logs through his neural interface. According to the records, Riley had been coming to this storage room for weeks now. Every day during her break, she'd slip away from her duties and hide here with something. The logs should have flagged this automatically, but there was a glitch in the system, a small error in the timestamp protocols. Nothing serious. Nothing that would cause any real problems. Nothing that would require immediate reporting. Jake could fix that glitch right now if he wanted to. He looked at Riley's face again. There were dark circles under her eyes, and her lips were slightly parted. She looked exhausted. She looked like someone who'd been running on empty for a long time. But her face was calm, peaceful, alive in a way that Jake rarely saw on humans anymore. They usually just looked tired and resigned to their place in the colony's vast machine. The drakeling stirred slightly, making a soft chirping sound, almost like a bird, but with an otherworldly quality to it. Riley's arms tightened instinctively around the creature, and she murmured something in her sleep that Jake's audio sensors couldn't quite pick up. Probably something protective. Something about keeping the dragon safe. Jake's hand hovered over his communication device. One press of a button and this would all be over. He'd file his report, follow protocol, and life would continue exactly as it always had. Clean. Orderly. According to the rules. But his hand didn't move to the button. Instead, Jake found himself accessing the security footage from the past 3 weeks. He started the deletion process, watching as weeks of evidence disappeared. It was treason. It was against everything he'd been trained to believe in. It was, by every official definition, wrong. And yet, as he looked at Riley sleeping peacefully with that impossible baby dragon in her arms, Jake realized something was shifting inside him. Something fundamental. Something that made him question whether following every rule was actually the same thing as doing the right thing. He quietly backed out of the room and sealed the door behind him. He had a lot of work to do and very little time to do it. Jake spent the next 2 hours doing something he'd never done before in his entire career. Lying. He falsified patrol logs, rerouted sensor sweeps, and created phantom reports that showed the storage sector as completely empty and secure. His fingers moved across the holographic interface with mechanical precision, Each keystroke a small betrayal of everything he'd sworn to uphold. By the time he finished, it would take a full investigation to uncover what he'd done. And by then maybe things would be different. Maybe he'd figure out what the hell he was doing. He gathered supplies from the commissary, real food, not the processed stuff that usually went to the lower-level workers. Fresh water. A thermal blanket that actually worked. Medical supplies for an unknown creature that probably had medical needs he couldn't even guess at. Nobody stopped him. Nobody asked questions. That was the thing about being a guardian. People just assumed you knew what you were doing. When Jake returned to storage room 7, the light was different. The day shift was ending and the station was quieter. He pushed the door open slowly, half expecting Riley to panic, to scream, to do something that would draw attention. Instead, she was awake, sitting up, watching him with eyes that were equal parts terrified and defiant. The baby drakeling was perched on her shoulder now, its tiny head swiveling to look at Jake with what seemed like intelligent curiosity. It made that chirping sound again and Riley's hand immediately went up to steady it. "Don't come closer," Riley said. Her voice was hoarse, like she'd been crying. "I know what you are. I know what the rules say. But I'm not giving her up. Not without a fight." Jake stopped walking. He stood there in the middle of the storage room, his crystalline body probably looking every bit as alien and terrifying as she must have thought it was. He could see her muscles tensing, preparing for conflict. This was the moment where everything would be decided. "I'm not here to take her," Jake said. His vocal synthesizer made the words sound formal and cold, but he tried to put something gentler into them. Something human even though he wasn't. "I'm here to help you. If you'll let me." Riley didn't move. The dragon, she'd called it Ember earlier, Jake remembered from her sleep talking, made another chirping sound and nuzzled against her neck. The creature seemed completely unafraid of Jake, which was interesting. Usually animals could sense danger. If Ember wasn't afraid, maybe she knew something that Riley didn't. "Why?" Riley asked. Just one word, but it carried the weight of everything. Every broken rule, every decision that didn't make sense, every moment that went against logic and protocol. "You're supposed to report me. You're supposed to take her away. That's the job, right? That's what you do." Jake moved slowly, setting the supplies down on the ground between them. He made sure his movements were deliberate and calm. No sudden gestures. No threatening postures. Just a guardian who decided to stop being a robot and start being something else. "I deleted the footage," Jake said quietly. "The last 2 hours are gone. As far as the system knows, this room has been empty all day. I falsified the patrol records. I made it look like everything in this sector is exactly as it should be." Riley's eyes widened. You're risking everything." "Yes," Jake said. And it was true. He was risking his position, his freedom, his entire identity. 300 cycles of service, gone. All because he couldn't ignore what he'd seen when he looked at this woman and this dragon. "Why would you do that?" Riley's voice cracked. Tears were streaming down her face now, tears of fear and relief and something else that Jake's processors couldn't quite categorize. Human emotions were complicated that way. Jake moved closer very slowly and knelt down on the floor. It was an awkward position for his crystalline frame, but it made him less threatening. It put him at eye level with Riley instead of looming over her like a judge delivering a sentence. "Because I watched you sleep," Jake said. "I watched the way you held her. The way you protected her even in your dreams. And I realized something that my people forgot a long time ago. Some things matter more than rules. Some things matter more than following orders." Ember hopped down from Riley's shoulder and walked right over to Jake. The baby dragon was small enough to fit in his palm, and its scales were warm to the touch. It looked up at him with eyes that seemed impossibly old and impossibly young at the same time. "Her name is Ember?" Jake asked. Riley nodded, wiping her tears away. "I found her in the ventilation shaft 3 weeks ago. She was starving. Terrified. I couldn't just leave her there." "Of course you couldn't," Jake said. And in that moment he understood something fundamental about humans. They didn't follow rules because they were supposed to. They broke rules because they had to. Because their hearts demanded it. Because love didn't care about protocol. "What happens now?" Riley whispered. "Now," Jake said, standing up carefully with Ember settled in his hands, "we keep her safe. And we figure out the rest together. 3 rotations. 72 hours. It didn't sound like much time until you were living it, and then it felt like an eternity stretched out between heartbeats. Jake had become a master of deception in those 3 days, something he never thought possible for a being built on logic and precision. Every report he filed was a lie. Every sensor adjustment was a betrayal. Every moment he spent with Riley and Ember was a small act of rebellion against everything he'd ever believed in. The storage room became their sanctuary. Jake brought food, real food, not the synthetic stuff. He brought blankets and heating elements to keep Ember comfortable. He brought books about dragon biology, though most of them were ancient texts that had been archived and nearly forgotten. Nothing matched Ember perfectly. The species was so rare that modern science had almost no data on them. It was like trying to solve a puzzle where half the pieces had been destroyed centuries ago. Riley had started talking more. On the first day she'd barely said anything, just watched him with cautious eyes while he set up a proper nesting area in the corner of the storage room. By the second day she told him her story. How she'd worked at the colony for 5 years with almost no recognition. How she cleaned up after important people, made their spaces livable, and received barely enough credits to survive. How she'd felt invisible until the moment she found Ember gasping for breath in the ventilation system. "I knew I should have reported her," Riley said on the second rotation, sitting cross-legged on the floor while Ember perched on her lap, pecking gently at some fruit Jake had brought. "Everyone would have told me to report her. But the moment I saw her, I couldn't do it. She wasn't a threat. She was just alive. Trying to survive. Just like me." Jake sat across from her, his crystalline form creating fractured rainbows on the walls when the light hit him just right. He'd never really thought about what it meant to be invisible until he listened to Riley talk about her life. "My people would say you made an illogical choice," Jake said slowly, picking his words carefully. "They would say that emotions clouded your judgment. That you should have followed protocol. But you don't think that," Riley said. "It wasn't a question." "No," Jake admitted. "I don't. And that terrifies me more than anything else." For 300 cycles, Jake had existed in a world of absolutes. Right and wrong. Allowed and forbidden. Efficient and wasteful. His entire civilization was built on these clear distinctions, and they'd always made sense to him. But watching Riley care for Ember, watching her sing softly to the dragon when she thought no one was listening, watching her teach the creature to trust by offering her hands slowly and patiently, Jake started to see cracks in everything he'd been taught. "Why did you really delete that footage?" Riley asked on the third rotation. Ember was sleeping now, curled up in a ball of shimmering violet scales, making soft snoring sounds that almost sounded like purring. "Don't give me the official answer. Tell me the truth." Jake was quiet for a long moment. His processors hummed softly as he searched for words to describe something that didn't fit into his usual vocabulary. "Because watching you sleep with her in your arms made me question something fundamental," Jake finally said. "I was taught that emotions are weaknesses. That compassion is inefficient. That attachment to individual lives is illogical when you're supposed to serve the greater good. But standing there looking at you two, I realized something my people have forgotten." "What?" Riley leaned forward, her eyes intense. "That the greater good is just a collection of individual lives," Jake said. "And if you don't care about individual lives, if you treat them as just statistics or data points, then what are you really serving? What's the point of order and rules and protocol if nobody's actually living? If nobody's actually allowed to matter?" Riley's eyes filled with tears again, but this time she was smiling. "That's the most human thing I've heard a Valerian say." "Is it?" Jake tilted his head slightly. "I'm not sure I'm Valerian anymore. My entire worldview is shifting. I'm starting to question everything. The way my people treat humans like they're less important. The way we've built this entire society on the assumption that efficiency and order matter more than individual choice. More than love." Ember stirred in her sleep and made a small chirping sound. Without thinking about it, Riley reached over and stroked the dragon's head gently. Jake watched her do it, watched the tenderness in her gesture, and understood that this was what his people had been missing. This was what 300 cycles of rigid order had cost them, the ability to see beauty in something as simple as one living creature caring for another. "I need to tell you something," Jake said quietly. "An inspection is scheduled for tomorrow. They're going to check my sector. They're going to find this room. And when they do, everything's going to change." Riley's face went pale, but she didn't panic. She just nodded slowly, like she'd always known this moment was coming. "Then we need to be ready," she said simply. "We need to be ready for whatever comes next." Jake knew he had maybe 6 hours before everything fell apart. The inspection notice had come through at midnight, a routine sweep they called it, though nothing about the timing felt routine. Someone had flagged his sector for review. Someone had noticed the anomalies in his reports. And in 6 hours, trained investigators would walk through that storage room and find everything he'd been trying to protect. He made a decision that would either save Riley and Ember or destroy him completely. Director Thomas ran the Colonial Administration from an office on the upper levels, a place Jake rarely went. The upper levels were for important people, for those who made decisions that affected everyone else. Jake had never had reason to go there before. He'd never questioned authority enough to need to. But now, with Riley and Ember waiting in that storage room and the clock ticking down, he made his way up through the station's central shaft. The director's assistant tried to stop him at the entrance. "Guardians don't just walk in without appointment," she said, looking flustered. Jake had never intimidated humans intentionally before, but he used his height and his alien appearance to his advantage now. He needed to see Director Thomas immediately. Thomas was a man in his 60s, with gray hair and tired eyes that suggested he'd seen more than his share of colony problems. He looked up from his desk with surprise when Jake entered without being announced. "Guardian Jake," Thomas said, standing up. "This is unusual. What can I do for you?" Jake closed the door behind him and made a choice that would define the rest of his life. He told Thomas everything. About finding Riley and Ember. About the baby drakeling that shouldn't exist. About falsifying reports and deleting evidence. About how he'd come to believe that protocol mattered less than preserving a life that had value simply because it existed. Thomas listened without interrupting, his expression shifting from confusion to understanding to something that looked almost like respect. When Jake finished, the director was quiet for a long moment. "You understand what you're confessing?" Thomas finally asked. "You're admitting to treason against the Valerian Collective. They could execute you for this." "I know," Jake said. "But I'm also telling you that something is wrong with how we run this colony. Something is fundamentally broken if we destroy life just because it doesn't fit into our categories. If we punish compassion. If we treat humans like you're less important than our rules." Thomas leaned back in his chair, studying Jake carefully. "You've thought about this?" "For 3 rotations I've done nothing but think about it," Jake said. "And the more I think, the more I realize my people are missing something crucial. We're missing the ability to see that individual lives matter. That love matters. That sometimes the right choice isn't the logical one." Thomas stood up and walked to the window that looked out over the colony. Thousands of humans were down there, working, living, trying to make lives for themselves in this impossible place far from Earth. "There might be a way," Thomas said slowly. "The Valerian Council accepts petitions from colonial administrators. It's rare and most petitions get rejected, but they do accept them. If I petition the Council on behalf of the colony, arguing that preserving this drakeling serves our long-term interests, and if you provide testimony about your discovery, we might be able to get an emergency hearing before the investigators arrive." "How much time would that take?" Jake asked, already knowing the answer wouldn't be enough. "At least 4 hours to draft the petition and send it through proper channels," Thomas said. "And the investigators arrive in approximately 5.5 hours. It was a desperate gamble. It was the kind of plan that worked only in stories, not in real life. But Thomas was already moving, pulling up communication protocols and starting to compose the petition. Jake stood there, watching this human work against the system to save someone he'd never met, and felt something shift inside his chest. The petition was detailed and passionate. Thomas wrote about genetic diversity, about the potential scientific value of studying a creature thought to be extinct. But more importantly, he wrote about compassion. He wrote about the colony's responsibility to preserve life when possible. He wrote about what it meant to be human, and what it meant for a Valerian to recognize that value. Jake added his own statement, a testimony from a guardian of the Valerian Collective, questioning the wisdom of absolute protocol. His words were carefully chosen, designed to resonate with the Council's logical minds while also introducing concepts they might have forgotten. The idea that rules existed to serve life, not the other way around. The petition was sent at 5:47 a.m., just 43 minutes before the inspection team was scheduled to arrive at the storage sector. They waited in Thomas's office, watching the communication channels. 15 minutes before the inspection, a response came through. Not a denial. Not an approval. But something better. An emergency hearing had been granted. The Valerian Council wanted to review the case in real time before any action was taken. The investigators arrived to find Jake standing in front of the storage room door with Director Thomas beside him. When they tried to enter, Jake calmly informed them that the case was now under review by the High Council and that the room was sealed pending their decision. It was a standoff. And as Jake stood there looking at the investigators' confused faces, he understood that the real battle was just beginning. The petition had bought them time. But time was all they had. The council's decision came through at 3:47 p.m. on a Tuesday that would change everything. Jake stood in Director Thomas's office, watching the message appear on the holographic display, hardly believing what he was reading. The words were formal and precise, written in the clinical language that the Valerian Collective always used, but their meaning was revolutionary. The Drakeling species ban was lifted, effective immediately. The creature was no longer classified as prohibited fauna. More than that, the council had reviewed Jake's testimony and found merit in his arguments about the limitations of absolute protocol. They had decided to create an entirely new position, cultural liaison between the Valerian Collective and the human colonists. Someone who could bridge the gap between two species that had never truly understood each other. And they wanted Jake to fill that position. Director Thomas smiled when he saw the color drain from Jake's face. "Congratulations," Thomas said simply. "You've just changed the course of colonial history." "I don't understand," Jake said, even though part of him did. "They're not executing me for treason. They're promoting me." "They're recognizing that you were right," Thomas said. "Your people's council has decided that rigid protocol without wisdom is actually a liability, not a strength. They want someone who understands both sides. Someone who can help your entire civilization learn what you've already figured out." When Jake returned to the storage room, he found Riley sitting with Ember perched on her shoulder, both of them looking smaller and more fragile than they had before. The stress of the past 3 rotations had worn on Riley like weather on stone. But when she saw Jake, something shifted in her expression. "It's over?" she asked quietly. "It's over," Jake confirmed. "And it's just beginning." He told her everything. About the council's decision. About the lifted ban. About the new position they were offering him. Riley listened with tears streaming down her face, but this time they were tears of relief mixed with something else. Uncertainty maybe about what came next. "What are you going to do?" Riley asked. "Are you going back to being a guardian?" Jake looked at Ember, at the way the baby dragon nuzzled against Riley's cheek with complete trust. He thought about 300 cycles of following orders, of believing that logic and efficiency mattered more than individual lives. He thought about standing in that storage room and seeing something beautiful that didn't fit into any category. "No," Jake said. "I'm going to be a cultural liaison. They'll have me. If you'll work with me." "Me?" Riley looked shocked. "What would I do?" "Head the conservation program," Jake said. "You're the only person who's ever successfully cared for a Drakeling. You understand them. More importantly, you understand what it means to protect something that matters. The council wants to study Ember to understand the species. But they want to do it with compassion. With someone who actually cares about her well-being, not just the data." Within a week, everything had changed. The storage room was converted into a proper habitat for Ember. Sunlight, real sunlight from the station's artificial systems, was piped in to keep the baby dragon healthy. Riley was given official status as head of the Drakeling Conservation Program, with a team of human researchers and Valerian scientists working under her direction. Jake became the bridge between them, translating not just language but philosophy. He helped the Valerian scientists understand why preserving individual lives mattered. He helped the human team understand the council's need for data and structure. But more importantly, Ember became something unexpected. A symbol. Within 3 months, news of the Drakeling's discovery had spread throughout the Valerian Collective. The baby dragon's image was broadcast across every communication channel. Humans and Valorians alike became fascinated by the creature that had sparked such a fundamental change in how two species related to each other. Ember wasn't just a scientific curiosity. She was proof that transformation was possible. Jake watched Riley work with Ember one afternoon, teaching the growing dragon to respond to simple commands. The creature had tripled in size already, her violet scales deepening to a richer shade as she matured. Riley was patient and gentle, never forcing, always encouraging. And Ember responded with obvious affection, chirping excitedly whenever Riley entered the habitat. "She's going to be beautiful," Jake said, standing beside them. "She already is," Riley replied. "But I think she's going to be more than that. I think she's going to help people understand each other." Jake realized something in that moment. Humans didn't conquer through weapons or strength or superior intellect. They conquered through something far more powerful, the ability to awaken conscience in others. Riley had awakened something in Jake that his entire civilization had forgotten how to feel. And now, through Ember, they were awakening something in the entire Valerian Collective. On the first anniversary of Ember's discovery, the colony held a celebration. Humans and Valorians stood together in the central plaza, watching as Ember, now the size of a large dog, flew in graceful circles above them. Her wings caught the light and scattered it into 1,000 colors. Riley stood with tears of joy streaming down her face. Jake stood beside her, his crystalline form catching the same light, creating rainbows that seemed to stretch between the two species. Director Thomas approached them with a formal document. "The Council wants to expand the Cultural Liaison Program," he said. "They want more positions created, more bridges built. And they want you to help train the next generation of liaisons, Jake. They want Valorians to learn what you learned, that compassion isn't weakness. That individual lives matter. That sometimes the most logical choice is to follow your conscience." Jake looked at Ember, at Riley, at the humans and Valorians mingling peacefully in the plaza. He thought about that moment in the storage room when he'd chosen to delete the surveillance footage instead of following protocol. He thought about how one small act of compassion had rippled outward, changing everything. "I'll do it," Jake said simply. "Because I finally understand what my people were missing. We were so focused on being efficient that we forgot to be alive." As the celebration continued around them, Ember landed on Riley's shoulder, and Jake stood with them both, knowing that this moment, this impossible convergence of two worlds, was just the beginning of something far greater than any of them could have imagined.